The news reports that flickered across television screens spoke in careful tones, announcing the death of a legend as though dignity alone could contain the truth. They spoke of awards, of timeless beauty, of an icon lost. Yet behind those headlines lived a far darker story, one shaped by obsession, illness, and a mind that burned brighter than it could endure. The world would remember her as unforgettable. Hollywood would remember her as untouchable. But on July 8, 1967, when Vivien Leigh was found lifeless in her London apartment, the silence that followed carried questions no broadcast dared to ask. How did the most luminous woman in cinema slowly disappear inside her own mind? And what really happened behind the carefully painted smile? The mystery begins long before the camera loved her, on February 20th, 1930, when Vivien Leigh stood on the stage of the Old Vic Theatre in London, trembling with anticipation, not from stage fright, but from the strange storms already stirring inside her. Those close to her would later recall moments when brilliance and fragility collided without warning, moments when laughter became fury, devotion turned into paranoia, and ambition slipped into obsession. At the time, no one had a name for it. They only whispered that something inside her was burning too fiercely. To understand the madness that would one day consume her, we must rewind to the beginning, to a child born far from Hollywood's lights, into a world already split between control and chaos. Vivien Mary Hartley was born on November 5, 1913, in Darjeeling, British India, a mist-covered hill station where colonial order masked emotional distance. Her father, Ernest Hartley, was a stern British officer, disciplined and emotionally remote. Her mother, Gertrude Robinson, was imaginative, theatrical, and deeply ambitious for her daughter, projecting dreams Vivien did not yet understand, but would spend her life chasing. From childhood, Vivien learned two lessons that would shape her fate. Love was conditional, and perfection was expected. She was trained to perform before she was taught to feel. Even as a girl, she slipped effortlessly into accents, gestures, and stories, but behind the performance lived a constant fear of failure, a terror of being unseen. At just 6 years old, Vivien declared she would be famous, not hopeful, certain. Those words did not come from confidence, but from necessity. Fame, to her, meant safety. It meant control over a world that already felt unpredictable. Her parents sent her to boarding schools across England and Europe, a lonely upbringing that fostered both independence and emotional isolation. She learned to observe rather than connect, to study human behavior rather than trust it. According to those close to her later in life, this was where the fractures first appeared: mood swings, intense fixations, sudden emotional withdrawals. In an era with no language for mental illness, these signs were dismissed as temperament, as artistry, as femininity. By her teenage years in London, Vivien was strikingly beautiful, but beauty alone was never enough for her. She craved validation with a hunger that frightened even her. She enrolled briefly at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art, where instructors noticed her talent, but also her volatility. She could be mesmerizing one day, unreachable the next. She absorbed criticism like poison and praise like oxygen. On December 20, 1932, at just 19 years old, Vivien married barrister Herbert Lee Holman, a decision driven less by love than by security. The marriage offered social respectability and a new surname, but it suffocated her ambition. Within months, she was restless, resentful, and secretly auditioning for roles without her husband's knowledge. When she gave birth to her daughter, Suzanne, in October 1933, the world expected motherhood to ground her. Instead, it deepened her sense of entrapment. According to those close to the family, Vivien experienced severe emotional distress after childbirth, withdrawing from domestic life and showing signs of what would later be understood as postpartum depression, layered upon an already unstable psyche. By 1935, Vivien had abandoned the idea of a conventional life entirely. She began appearing in British films, small roles that barely hinted at the intensity she carried. Then, on June 28, 1936, everything changed when she met Laurence Olivier during the filming of Fire over England. Their connection was immediate, electric, and destructive. Two married people bound by obsession, ambition, and emotional volatility. Some believe that Olivier became both her anchor and her trigger. According to those close to them, their relationship intensified her extremes. When loved, she soared. When threatened, she unraveled. Their affair became an open secret, scandalous even by theatrical standards, yet the public saw only romance and brilliance. Behind closed doors, Vivien's behavior grew increasingly erratic. She slept little, rehearsed obsessively, and exploded into rage without warning. She accused friends of betrayal, suffered emotional collapses, then rebounded with terrifying energy. Doctors dismissed it as nerves. Studios ignored it because she was profitable. Then came the role that would immortalize her and quietly destroy her. On December 26, 1939, Gone with the Wind premiered in Atlanta, and Vivien Leigh became Scarlett O'Hara, the most iconic performance in cinematic history. Overnight, she transformed from a rising actress into a global obsession. Fame did not arrive gently. It descended like a storm. The pressure was unbearable. Vivien was no longer allowed to fail, rest, or disappear. Her identity fused with Scarlett's defiance, obsession, and emotional volatility. She lost weight dangerously fast, barely slept, and became fixated on control. According to those close to the production, she suffered nervous breakdowns during filming, oscillating between brilliance and collapse. When she won the Academy Award for Best Actress on February 29, 1940, the world applauded. Inside, something fractured permanently. Success did not stabilize her. It intensified her illness. The madness did not begin after fame. Fame simply gave it a stage. And as the world crowned her immortal, the shadows she had carried since childhood finally began to take control. Fame did not steady Vivien Leigh. It sharpened her edges and stripped away whatever fragile balance she had left. After the triumph of February 29, 1940, when she stood beneath the Academy lights holding an Oscar, those closest to her sensed that the victory had come at a terrible cost. The applause fed her, but it also trapped her inside an impossible expectation. She was no longer allowed to be human. She was required to be perfect. By the early 1940s, Vivien's behavior had begun to frighten even those who loved her most. She slept in bursts of manic energy, then collapsed into days of silence. She rehearsed obsessively, demanding absolute control over every gesture, every breath. According to those close to her, she became increasingly paranoid, convinced that people were conspiring against her, mocking her, or attempting to replace her. In public, she dazzled. In private, she unraveled. On August 31, 1940, Vivien Leigh and Laurence Olivier finally divorced their respective spouses and married each other, sealing one of the most celebrated unions in theatrical history. To the public, they were royalty. Two of the greatest actors alive, bonded by genius and passion. But behind closed doors, their marriage was volatile, fueled by emotional dependency and relentless pressure. Vivien adored Olivier with an intensity that bordered on desperation. She feared abandonment obsessively, monitoring his movements, accusing him of infidelity, even when none could be proven. Some believe her illness amplified her, jealousy into delusion, turning love into torment. Olivier, himself ambitious and disciplined, struggled to manage her unpredictable moods while protecting his own career. By 1941, Vivien was experiencing severe physical and psychological symptoms that could no longer be ignored. She suffered violent mood swings, memory lapses, and periods of hallucination. Doctors prescribed sedatives, stimulants, and rest cures, treatments that often worsened her condition. The true diagnosis, bipolar disorder, would not be formally acknowledged until much later. At the time, her illness was labeled hysteria, exhaustion, or emotional instability. That same year, she began suffering from tuberculosis, a diagnosis confirmed in late 1944, a disease that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The combination of physical illness and untreated mental disorder created a cycle of breakdown and recovery that repeated relentlessly. Each comeback was celebrated, each collapse was hidden. Despite her suffering, Vivien continued to deliver extraordinary performances. On July 21, 1948, she appeared on Broadway as Blanche Dubois in A Streetcar Named Desire, a role that felt disturbingly close to her own unraveling. Blanche was fragile, haunted, desperate to preserve an illusion of control as reality closed in. Night after night, Vivien poured herself into the role until the line between character and self began to dissolve. According to those close to the production, her performances were electrifying but erratic. She forgot lines, lashed out at cast members, and collapsed backstage from exhaustion. Some believe that Blanche did not merely reflect Vivien's madness, but accelerated it. The role consumed her. When the film adaptation was released, Vivien won her second Academy Award on March 20, 1952, an achievement that should have cemented her legacy. Instead, it marked another psychological breaking point. The acclaim intensified her fear of decline, her terror of losing relevance, her obsession with perfection. By the mid-1950s, her behavior had become increasingly unpredictable. Rumors persisted that she would scream uncontrollably, accuse friends of betrayal, and wander hotel corridors in nightgowns during manic episodes. Some believe she experienced hallucinations during periods of extreme stress. According to those close to Olivier, he often returned home to find her unrecognizable, oscillating between childlike vulnerability and violent rage. In 1953, during a stage production in Australia, Vivien suffered a severe mental breakdown. She attacked Olivier during a psychotic episode, an incident that shocked those who witnessed it and confirmed the depth of her illness. She was hospitalized, sedated, and quietly removed from the public eye. The press was told she was exhausted. The truth was far more disturbing. Her marriage began to fracture under the strain. Olivier loved her, but he could not save her. He later admitted that living with Vivien meant living in constant fear, never knowing which version of her would appear. By 1957, their relationship had deteriorated beyond repair, eroded by illness, resentment, and emotional exhaustion. On July 7, 1960, Vivien Leigh and Laurence Olivier divorced. The announcement stunned the public. The greatest acting couple in the world had collapsed, and with it, the illusion that brilliance could conquer anything. Vivien took the separation as a personal annihilation. According to those close to her, she spiraled into deep depression, convinced that without Olivier, she no longer existed, yet even in decline, she refused to disappear. In the early 1960s, Vivien attempted to rebuild her life and career. She continued acting in stage productions, though her health was deteriorating rapidly. Tuberculosis ravaged her lungs. Bipolar episodes returned with greater severity. Some believe the years of medication, combined with physical illness, accelerated her decline. Her final, public appearances were haunting. On April 23, 1963, she appeared on stage in Tovarich, delivering moments of brilliance punctuated by visible exhaustion. Audience members later recalled her frailty, her trembling hands, her eyes burning with an intensity that felt almost painful to witness. By 1966, Vivien was largely withdrawn from public life, living quietly in London, cared for by friends who watched her fade. She spoke openly about her illness in rare moments of clarity, acknowledging the darkness that had shaped her life, yet still clinging to the belief that performance had given her purpose. Then came the final silence. On July 8, 1967, Vivien Leigh was found dead in her apartment, her body weakened by tuberculosis, her mind finally at rest. She was 53 years old. The newspapers called it a tragic but dignified passing. They did not speak of the years of torment, the untreated illness, the brilliance that burned too hot for its time. In death, she was mythologized. In life, she was misunderstood. Her legacy endures not because she was perfect, but because she was painfully real. Vivien Leigh gave the world unforgettable beauty and unforgettable pain, performances born not from safety, but from survival. Her madness was never a spectacle. It was a battle fought alone, behind velvet curtains and golden statues. The news reports that announced her death closed the story with reverence, but they never captured the truth. That beneath the legend lived a woman who felt too much, dreamed too fiercely, and paid the ultimate price for brilliance in a world that demanded silence from its suffering stars. And somewhere beyond the headlines, beyond the applause, Vivien Leigh remains, forever frozen between light and shadow, a reminder that Hollywood's brightest stars often burn themselves out long before the world is ready to let them rest. Death did not end Vivien Leigh's story. It merely sealed it inside legend. In the weeks following July 8, 1967, as newspapers softened their language and memorials praised her elegance, those who had truly known her struggled with an entirely different grief. They mourned not only the woman who had died, but the many versions of Vivien that had vanished long before her heart stopped. The vibrant child with impossible certainty. The young actress burning with hunger. The global icon trapped inside her own reflection. And finally, the fragile figure pacing her apartment alone, whispering lines from plays that had once given her meaning. After her death, it quietly emerged that Vivien Leigh had lived for decades with bipolar disorder, a truth that reframed her entire life in retrospect. The erratic brilliance, the explosive rages, the periods of euphoric creativity followed by crushing despair. What had once been dismissed as temperament or diva behavior was now understood as untreated mental illness unfolding under the harshest possible spotlight. During the late 1960s, psychiatry was still reluctant to acknowledge the toll fame took on vulnerable minds. Vivien became an unspoken cautionary tale. Studios preferred myth to diagnosis. Audiences preferred romance to reality. Her madness was repackaged as tragedy, her suffering as poetic inevitability. Laurence Olivier, who would live until July 11, 1989, rarely spoke in detail about their marriage, but when he did, his words carried unmistakable weight. He admitted that loving Vivien meant loving someone who could vanish without warning, replaced by fear, rage, or despair. He confessed that no amount of devotion could save someone drowning inside their own mind. Some believe Olivier carried lifelong guilt, haunted by the belief that leaving her accelerated her decline. Others argue that staying would have destroyed them both. The truth likely lives somewhere between love and survival. In the years after her death, Vivien Leigh's performances took on new meaning. Scarlett O'Hara's fierce defiance became less a romantic triumph and more a portrait of psychological endurance. Blanche Dubois' fragility felt no longer like acting, but confession. Audiences began to recognize that Vivien had not simply portrayed madness. She had lived alongside it, negotiated with it, and ultimately been consumed by it. By the 1970s, feminist film scholars began re-examining her legacy, questioning whether Hollywood had exploited her vulnerability while celebrating her beauty. Some argued that the industry rewarded her illness when it enhanced her performances and abandoned her when it became inconvenient. Others noted that Vivien herself demanded excellence beyond human limits, driving her body and mind toward collapse. Her daughter, Suzanne Farrington, remained largely private, rarely speaking about her mother. According to those close to the family, Suzanne grew up loving Vivien from a distance, aware that brilliance and instability were inseparable forces in her mother's life. Their relationship was affectionate but strained, shaped by long absences and emotional unpredictability. Vivien Leigh's home in London became a quiet shrine, filled with photographs frozen in time, youth, glamour, triumph. Yet those images could not capture the nights of terror, the hospital stays, the moments when she begged doctors to make her mind quiet, when she feared herself more than failure. Her ashes were scattered at St. Leonard's Church in Sussex, a place chosen not for fame, but for peace. No grand mausoleum, no Hollywood spectacle, just silence. Today, her name remains synonymous with cinematic immortality. Acting schools still dissect her performances. Filmmakers still chase the emotional truth she accessed so effortlessly and so dangerously. Yet behind every tribute lingers an uncomfortable question. How many artists like Vivien were destroyed because their suffering made them extraordinary? The mystery of Vivien Leigh is not simply how madness claimed her. It is why no one stopped it, Why was brilliance allowed to bleed until there was nothing left to give? Why the same world that applauded her breakdowns could not bear to acknowledge them? The news reports that announced her death framed it as an ending. In truth, it was the final act of a life lived at unbearable intensity. Vivien Leigh did not fade quietly. She burned, flickered, shattered, and left behind performances so raw they still breathe decades later. Some stars shine because they are strong. Others shine because they are fragile. Vivien Leigh shone because she was both. And as the screens went dark after those reports, one truth remained, haunting and unresolved. The madness that destroyed her was never separate from the genius that made her immortal.